The Soviet forces have now completely encircled the German 6th
By
Army.
January 1943, the Iron Ring of Soviet troops had closed around Stalingrad. Operation Uranus, which began on November 19, 1942, ended with the complete encirclement of the enemy grouping. 22 divisions and more than 200,000 soldiers and officers of Paulus's 6th Army were trapped in the cauldron. The German command rejected all surrender proposals, hoping for a relief strike from outside. An attempt to break through, undertaken by Army Group Don under the command of Field Marshal Manstein, ended in failure in December. Air supply to the encircled troops provided only a quarter of the necessary minimum. Frost, hunger, and disease weakened the combat effectiveness of German units. The Soviet command, having completed the repulsion of the relief strike, began preparing for the decisive operation. Ring was to be the final chord of the Battle of Stalingrad. The Stavka of the Supreme High Command entrusted the operation to the troops of the Don Front, under the command of Colonel General Rokossovsky. The encircled enemy, despite the most difficult conditions, created powerful defenses, turning the ruins of the city into a fortress. By early January 1943, the forces of the warring sides in the Stalingrad area presented a striking contrast. Paulus's encircled grouping, despite its dire situation, remained a serious combat force. Within the ring were the remnants of 14 infantry, 3 motorized, and 3 tank divisions, as well as air defense units and special detachments. The total strength was about 250,000 men, although no more than 190,000 remained combat-ready. The grouping was armed with about 400 tanks and assault guns, as well as over 600 artillery pieces of various calibers. The German command had created an echeloned defense, dividing the pocket into 3 sectors: northern, central, and southern. Every building was turned into a strong point. Cellars were connected by underground passages, and streets were covered by crossfire. Particularly strong fortifications were created on the western face of the pocket, where the main blow of Soviet troops was expected. The enemy maintained control over several airfields, including the key one, Potomnik, through which limited supplies were maintained for the encircled troops. The Soviet command countered this with a powerful grouping. The Don Front, under the command of Colonel General Konstantin Rokossovsky, included 6 combined arms armies, 1 air army, and several separate formations. The total troop strength exceeded 280,000 men, supported by 600 tanks and self-propelled guns. The artillery grouping numbered over 7,000 guns and mortars, ensuring overwhelming fire superiority. Key figures in the planning of the operation were Front Commander Rokossovsky, Chief of Staff Lieutenant General Malinin, and Artillery Commander Lieutenant General Kazakov. Colonel General Voronov, a leading artillery specialist, was appointed as the representative of the Stavka VGK. The operation plan envisaged splitting the pocket into 2 parts, with the subsequent destruction of each grouping separately. The main blow was delivered from the west by the forces of the 65th and 21st Armies, supported by tank and mechanized corps. Auxiliary strikes were planned from the north, south, and east. Special attention was paid to capturing airfields to completely deprive the enemy of supplies. The operation was to begin on January 10th with a powerful artillery preparation, designed to crush the first line of defense and demoralize the enemy. The Koltso Ring operation plan was developed under the personal supervision of the Stavka of the Supreme High Command. In early January, Rokossovsky presented Stalin with a detailed scheme for eliminating the encircled grouping, based on a thorough analysis of the situation. The key idea was to dismember the pocket with a powerful blow from west to east, followed by the piecemeal destruction of the separated enemy groupings. To implement the plan, a powerful strike force was created, including the 65th and 21st Armies, reinforced with tank and mechanized corps. Special attention was paid to the artillery support of the operation. The front's artillery commander, General Kazakov, and the Stavka representative, General Voronov, developed a unique fire destruction scheme that took into account urban conditions. The artillery density in the breakthrough sectors reached a record 150 barrels per kilometer of front. Special direct-fire gun groups were formed to destroy fortified buildings. Tank formations were planned to be used in compact groups, avoiding the dispersal of forces in urban areas. Each tank battalion received a clear objective and route of movement, taking into account the terrain features. The aviation of the 16th Air Army was to provide continuous support to the advancing troops, as well as block attempts to supply the encircled grouping by air. For this purpose, special fighter units were allocated, operating in the enemy's airfield zone. The General Staff made significant adjustments to the initial plan, strengthening the main strike direction and providing measures to prevent enemy counterattacks. The Stavka of the Supreme High Command approved the final version of the operation on January 7th, setting its start for January 10th. A distinctive feature of the plan was the consideration of urban combat conditions. For assaulting fortified buildings, special assault groups were created, including infantry, sappers, flamethrower operators, and artillerymen. Each such group underwent a brief but intensive training course. Engineer units were tasked with reconnoitering the underground communications system and preparing means for combat in basements and tunnels. The total duration of the operation was estimated at 7 to 8 days, which proved to be an overly optimistic forecast. Rokossovsky insisted on thorough preparation, understanding that even a weakened enemy in urban conditions was capable of offering serious resistance. The commander demanded detailed elaboration of every element of the offensive from his subordinates, including communications, supply, and evacuation of the wounded. The preparation for the decisive strike served as an example of meticulous military planning, taking into account all the peculiarities of the upcoming battles. The Soviet command concentrated an unprecedented artillery grouping, up to 180 barrels per kilometer of front, in the direction of the main thrust. Artillery regiments and brigades advanced to their positions under the cover of night, carefully camouflaging their guns in ruined buildings and craters. To combat enemy strongpoints, special direct-fire gun groups were formed, receiving specific targets based on intelligence data. Each such group included 2 to 5 guns of various calibers, from 45mm anti-tank guns to heavy howitzers. Particular attention was paid to creating assault groups for operations in urban areas. A typical assault group included a rifle platoon, reinforced with sappers, flamethrower operators, and machine gunners. Several such groups were combined into an assault detachment with attached artillery pieces, mortars, and tanks. Soldiers were trained in special techniques for street fighting, clearing buildings, blocking basements, and using smoke screens. Engineer reconnaissance worked with exceptional intensity. Sapper units under the command of Colonel Tkachenko conducted a detailed study of the German defenses. Scouts, operating in small groups, penetrated the neutral zone, recording the locations of firing points, minefields, and obstacles. Of particular value was data on underground communications, which the Germans actively used for troop maneuvering. Based on the information obtained, detailed schemes of enemy defenses were compiled, indicating all fortified buildings and bunkers. An analysis of the defense system showed that the Germans had created 3 defensive lines with strongholds on dominating heights and in sturdy buildings. The fortifications in the area of the village of Gorodishcha, Voroponovo Station, and the central part of the city were particularly powerful. Each stronghold was a complex of several buildings with embrasures, dugouts, and underground passages. The gaps between the strongholds were covered by cross-machine gun fire and protected by minefields. The western and southern sections of the encirclement, where the terrain was more open, proved to be the most vulnerable in the German defense. It was here that Rokossovsky decided to deliver the main blow to cut the cauldron in 2. Special attention was paid to preparing the troops for combat in harsh winter conditions. Temperatures dropped to -25 degrees, which required special measures to maintain the combat effectiveness of personnel. Soldiers were provided with warm uniforms, heating points were organized, and uninterrupted hot food was supplied. Equipment underwent special preparation for operation in frosty conditions. The morning of January 10, 1943, began for Paulus's encircled group with a deafening roar. At 8:55 a.m., over 5,000 guns and mortars of the Don Front unleashed a hurricane of fire upon enemy positions. The sky over Stalingrad darkened with smoke and dust, and the earth trembled under the continuous explosions of shells. The artillery preparation for Operation Koltso became one of the most powerful of the entire war. Soviet command developed a unique method of fire engagement, taking into account the specifics of urban conditions. The artillery operated according to a precisely calculated plan, divided into 3 stages. The first 55 minutes were dedicated to suppressing and destroying identified enemy firing points, especially on the front line. Then, 20 minutes for the destruction of strongholds and dugouts of the second line of defense. And finally, the concluding 10 minutes for a concentrated fire raid across the entire depth of the defense to demoralize the enemy before the infantry attack. Direct fire guns played a special role. Over 300 barrels of various calibers were advanced to a distance of 300 to 600 meters from the enemy's front line. Artillerymen conducted aimed fire at embrasures, pillboxes, and fortified buildings that the Germans had turned into strongpoints. The crews of anti-tank guns distinguished themselves with sniper-like accuracy, literally knocking out machine gun nests from the walls of buildings. In urban conditions, the work of spotters gained particular importance. Experienced artillery observers were positioned on forward positions, adjusting battery fire via radio, indicating target coordinates and the results of hits. This allowed for the most effective use of each shell, preventing useless shelling of already destroyed objects. The psychological impact of the artillery preparation on the defending troops was devastating. German soldiers, already exhausted by hunger, cold, and disease, found themselves under a continuous firestorm of unprecedented power. Survivors of the battles later recalled these hours as true hell. Many shelters were destroyed by direct hits from heavy shells. Communication lines were cut, and control was disrupted. Russian artillerymen employed the tactic of a rolling barrage, where fire was sequentially shifted deeper into the defense ahead of the advancing infantry. This allowed infantrymen to move forward, literally 200 to 300 meters from the explosions of their own shells, giving the enemy no chance to recover and take up firing positions. On January 10th, at 10 o'clock in the morning, after the completion of artillery preparation, the troops of the Don Front launched a decisive offensive from the western direction. The main strike was delivered by the 65th and 21st Armies, reinforced by tank formations. Despite the frozen ground and severe frost, Soviet units rapidly overcame the first line of German defenses, which in many places had been completely destroyed by artillery fire. Assault groups operated according to a well-practiced method. Each such group consisted of 20 to 30 fighters, including riflemen, machine gunners, sappers, and flamethrower operators. Movement was carried out in short dashes under the cover of smoke screens. Upon reaching a fortified building, the soldiers would throw grenades into the embrasures, then burst inside, clearing the premises of the enemy. Sappers immediately checked basements for booby traps and blocked underground passages that the Germans used to connect their strongholds. Tanks, operating in small groups of 3 to 5 vehicles, provided fire support to the infantry. They moved behind the assault groups at a distance of 100 to 200 meters, suppressing enemy firing points. Particularly effective were the T-34s with squads of submachine gunners mounted on them. Tank crews, having gained experience in urban battles, avoided narrow streets and thoroughfares where the Germans could set up ambushes with Panzerfausts and anti-tank guns. Artillery continuously supported the offensive. Batteries of regimental and divisional guns moved behind the infantry, taking up positions for direct fire. Mortar crews quickly deployed on captured lines and covered identified resistance nodes with fire. Coordination of actions between different branches of service was carried out through forward artillery observers who were with the infantry in their combat formations. The offensive in winter conditions had its own specifics. Deep snow hindered movement, but at the same time allowed for masking the movement of assault groups. White camouflage suits made the soldiers almost invisible against the snowy background. Freezing weather required special measures to maintain the combat effectiveness of personnel and equipment. On captured lines, warming points were immediately organized where soldiers could receive hot food and a short rest. By the end of the first day of the offensive, the troops of the Don Front had advanced 6 to 8 kilometers in the western direction, overcoming the first and partially the second lines of enemy defense. Particularly successful were the units of General Batov's 65th Army, which broke through the defenses in the area of Marinovka village. The German command attempted to organize counterattacks, but due to a shortage of reserves and fuel for equipment, they were quickly repelled with heavy losses for the enemy. A key element of the Soviet command's strategy in Operation Ring was the struggle for the supply airfields of the encircled group. By mid-January 1943, the Germans retained control over several airfields, the main one being Pitomnik Airfield, located 20 kilometers west of the center of Stalingrad. Through this air hub, the main supply of Paulus's troops was carried out. Ammunition, medicines, food were delivered, and the wounded were evacuated. Rokossovsky understood perfectly. The capture of the airfields would be a mortal blow to the encircled group. On January 13th, units of General Chistyakov's 21st Army reached the near approaches to Pitomnik. The German command, realizing the critical importance of the object, concentrated significant forces here, turning the airfield area into a powerful fortified strongpoint with circular defense. Each building of the airfield complex was a strongpoint with numerous firing positions. The assault on Pitomnik began on the morning of January 16th after a powerful artillery preparation. Soviet assault groups attacked from 3 directions simultaneously, preventing the enemy from maneuvering reserves. Particularly fierce fighting broke out for the command and control point, where the Germans offered fanatical resistance. Soviet tankers operating in small groups suppressed firing positions on the flanks, allowing the infantry to advance. By the evening of January 16th, Pitomnik was completely cleared of the enemy. The capture of the main airfield had catastrophic consequences for the encircled group. The air bridge, which was already functioning intermittently, was practically cut off. The Luftwaffe tried to organize supplies through smaller sites, Gumrak and Stalingradsky, but their capacity was insufficient. Soviet aviation and anti-aircraft artillery inflicted heavy losses on enemy transport aircraft. On January 22nd, Gumrak Airfield was taken, and on the 25th, the last landing site in the Stalingradsky area. The encircled group was completely cut off from supplies. Real famine began in German units, medicines ran out, and there was an acute shortage of ammunition. According to intelligence, the daily ration of a German soldier was reduced to 50 grams of bread and a small amount of horse meat. The tactic of isolating the enemy from supplies, consistently implemented by the Soviet command, became one of the key factors in the success of Operation Ring. Deprived of external support, suffering from hunger and cold, Paulus's troops quickly lost their combat effectiveness. In the testimonies of prisoners, words about the senselessness of further resistance and the inevitability of defeat were increasingly heard. Urban combat in Stalingrad demanded special tactics, which the Soviet command successfully developed and applied during Operation Ring. The primary combat unit became the assault group, a versatile subdivision capable of autonomously solving tactical problems in conditions of dense urban development. A typical assault group included 8 to 12 riflemen, 2 to 3 machine gun crews, 2 to 3 sapper squads, a flamethrower squad, and signalmen, totaling about 25 to 30 people. Several such groups were combined into an assault detachment with attached artillery pieces and mortars. The methodology for assault group operations was meticulously refined. Before attacking a fortified building, reconnaissance was conducted to identify firing points, entrances and exits, and underground communications. Then, artillery and mortars suppressed the identified enemy firing assets. Under the cover of fire and smoke screens, the assault group rapidly approached the objective. Flamethrowers incinerated embrasures and first-floor windows, after which riflemen threw grenades and stormed into the building. Simultaneously, the cover group blocked approaches, preventing the enemy from receiving reinforcements or retreating. Inside the building, fighting proceeded on a top-down principle. First, the upper floors were cleared, then the lower ones and basements. Sappers checked premises for booby traps and prepared passages in walls for advancement to the next objective. Particular attention was paid to basements and underground communications, where the Germans often established resistance strongholds and ammunition depots. Snipers played an exceptional role in urban combat. Taking positions on the upper floors of buildings, they controlled significant areas of terrain, identified and eliminated enemy firing points, command posts, and artillery observers. Sniper pairs operated autonomously, sometimes remaining in ambush for several days. The famous sniper Vasily Zaitsev, who developed hunting tactics, trained dozens of accurate shooters who inflicted serious damage on the enemy. Flamethrower operators with ROKS-3 backpack flamethrowers became the terror of German garrisons. A stream of burning mixture, ejected up to 35 meters, left no chance for the defenders of fortified positions. The psychological effect of using flamethrowers was enormous. There are known cases where the mere appearance of flamethrower operators forced the Germans to surrender. By January 23rd, Soviet command began implementing the key phase of Operation Ring, the dismemberment of the encircled group into isolated parts. This strategic move was dictated by the understanding that even a weakened but intact enemy posed a serious danger. Dividing the cauldron into several mini-cauldrons deprived the German command of the ability to maneuver reserves and concentrate forces in threatened directions. General Rokossovsky developed a detailed plan for breaking up the enemy's defenses. The main thrust was delivered from west to east through the central part of the cauldron, in the direction of Mamayev-Kurgan. Simultaneously, auxiliary strikes from the north and south were planned. This created a wedge effect, dissecting the enemy group into several isolated parts. On the night of January 26th, advanced units of the 65th Army linked up with units of the 21st Army in the area of Mamayev-Kurgan. The encircled group was cut into two parts, the southern, where Paulus's headquarters was located, and the northern, under the command of General Strecker. Communication between these groups was completely disrupted, which created serious problems with troop control. After dividing the main cauldron, Soviet troops began creating internal mini-cauldrons. The tactic involved identifying the most fortified strongholds of resistance and isolating them from adjacent defensive sectors. Assault groups penetrated the gaps between enemy strongpoints, cutting off supply and evacuation routes. Then, the encircled pockets of resistance were successively suppressed by concentrated artillery fire and assault groups. This tactic proved particularly effective in the southern part of the cauldron, where dense urban development created favorable conditions for isolating individual blocks. Soviet troops blockaded entire urban areas, turning them into isolated islands of resistance. Deprived of support, ammunition, and food, these garrisons rapidly lost their combat effectiveness and were forced to capitulate. In the northern part of the cauldron, where the terrain was more open, the tactic of cutting off individual heights and settlements, followed by their assault, was employed. Tank groups conducted deep raids into the enemy's rear, disrupting the command and supply system. Artillery fired at identified headquarters and communication nodes, further disorganizing the defense. The factory districts in the southern part of the Stalingrad cauldron represented a special type of combat space, demanding specific tactical approaches. Here were located giant industrial complexes, the tractor plant, barricades, Red October, with their enormous workshops, administrative buildings, storage facilities, and underground communications. German troops transformed these industrial giants into veritable fortresses with a multi-layered defense system. The Soviet command developed a special methodology for assaulting such objectives. Traditional tactical schemes, applied in urban areas, did not work here due to the specific layout of the factory territories. Enormous workshops with high ceilings, metal structures, and an abundance of technological equipment created a unique environment for conducting battle. A key element of the new tactics was reinforced assault groups of special composition. These included additional flamethrower crews, sappers with a large supply of explosives, and fighters who had experience working at industrial facilities. The latter were well-oriented in production premises and understood the specifics of the factory infrastructure. Before the assault, thorough reconnaissance was conducted. Sappers and scouts studied the layout of the workshops, identified enemy firing points, and determined the most vulnerable points in the defense. Special attention was paid to underground communications, ventilation systems, technological tunnels, basement premises, which the Germans actively used for covert maneuvering of forces. Artillery preparation during the assault on factory complexes had its own peculiarities. Powerful reinforced concrete structures of industrial buildings well protected the defenders from shrapnel and shock waves. Therefore, the main emphasis was placed on large-caliber guns and aimed direct fire. Artillerymen received specific tasks to destroy certain structural elements: load-bearing columns, ceilings, walls. The assault on factory premises was conducted simultaneously from several directions. While the main forces attacked through main entrances and breaches in the walls, small groups infiltrated through ventilation shafts, upper floor windows, and technical passages. This created the effect of a volume assault, where the enemy was attacked from all sides, including the ceiling and floor. Particular difficulty was presented by the enormous factory workshops with many machine tools, conveyors, and other equipment, which created natural barricades and shelters. Here, the battle took on the character of an industrial labyrinth, where visibility was limited to a few meters, and the enemy could appear from any side. In such conditions, Soviet assault groups operated by the method of combing, advancing forward in short dashes and meticulously checking every shelter. An effective technique was the use of fire sacks. Assault groups deliberately left passages in some directions, luring the enemy into pre-prepared kill zones, where they were met with crossfire from machine guns and submachine guns. In the confined spaces of the workshops, such tactics yielded impressive results. The battles in the factory districts were distinguished by exceptional ferocity. Every workshop, every warehouse, every boiler room became an arena for bloody clashes. The count was literally in meters of captured territory. German troops, understanding the strategic importance of industrial facilities, offered fanatical resistance. However, the methodical pressure of Soviet assault groups, supported by artillery and aviation, gradually broke the enemy's defense. By the end of January 1943, the enemy's northern grouping in the Stalingrad pocket found itself in a critical situation. Soviet command began the methodical compression of the encirclement ring, employing tactics honed in previous battles. The main task of eliminating the northern part of the pocket was entrusted to the 65th Army of General Batov and the 21st Army of General Chistyakov. The operation to compress the ring required meticulous coordination of various branches of service. Artillery created a rolling barrage, systematically shifted into the depth of the enemy's defense. Infantry assault groups advanced literally on the heels of exploding shells, giving the enemy no chance to recover. Tanks operated in compact groups of 3 to 5 vehicles, supporting the infantry and suppressing identified firing points. In the central districts of the city, where the northern grouping was concentrated, the Germans had created a powerful defense system. Every stone building was transformed into a miniature fortress with embrasures, underground passages, and minefields. Particularly strong resistance nodes were located in the area of the railway station, the central square, and the complex of administrative buildings. Commanders of Soviet units displayed extraordinary tactical ingenuity. Colonel Yudnikov, whose division operated in the northern part of the city, employed the method of infiltration. Small assault groups penetrated the gaps between enemy strongpoints and attacked them from the rear and flanks. Major Chernus, commander of an assault battalion, developed an effective tactic for blocking basement premises, where the Germans often established command posts and supply depots. Engineer units played a key role in overcoming the enemy's defenses. Sappers cleared passages through minefields, destroyed barricades, and created breaches in building walls. Of particular value were the rat catchers, soldiers specializing in operations in underground communications, which the Germans actively used for maneuvering forces. Aviation of the 16th Air Army provided significant support to ground troops. Il-2 ground attack aircraft delivered pinpoint strikes on identified resistance nodes, while fighters reliably covered them from the few but still active Luftwaffe fighters. Bombers targeted enemy rear facilities, depots, command posts, and artillery positions. Gradually, the ring around the northern grouping tightened. By January 28th, Soviet troops had cut it into several isolated pockets of resistance. Deprived of communication with each other, suffering from a severe shortage of ammunition and food, German units lost their ability to offer organized resistance. Cases of mass surrender of entire units began to occur. On January 31st, 1943, an event of immense symbolic significance occurred in the history of the Great Patriotic War. The capitulation of the southern grouping of the 6th Army of the Wehrmacht, led by its commander, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus. This was preceded by the dramatic events of the last days of January, when Soviet troops methodically tightened the encirclement around the remnants of a once mighty army. By January 30th, the southern grouping was squeezed into a few blocks in the central part of the city. Paulus's headquarters were located in the basement of a ruined department store, converted into a fortified command post. Here, in the damp concrete room, the fate of the remnants of the 6th Army was decided. The day before, on January 30th, Hitler promoted Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal, a gesture with an ominous subtext. In the entire history of the German army, no field marshal had ever surrendered. The Führer unambiguously hinted at the necessity of suicide in a hopeless situation. However, Paulus, physically and morally exhausted, made a different decision. On the morning of January 31st, Soviet troops approached the department store building. The Chief of Staff of the 6th Army, General Schmidt, emerged with a white flag for negotiations. He was taken to the commander of the 64th Army, General Shumilov. A few hours later, the parliamentarians returned with an ultimatum for unconditional surrender. Paulus, after a brief meeting with his staff officers, accepted the terms. At noon on January 31st, a group of Soviet officers, led by the deputy commander of the 64th Army, Lieutenant General Laskin, entered the department store basement. A depressing scene met their gaze. Emaciated, unshaven men in dirty uniforms with dull eyes. Paulus himself lay on an iron bed, covered by a greatcoat. He was pale, with sunken eyes and a nervous tic on his face. When offered to surrender, the field marshal silently nodded his head. Soon after, Paulus and his entire staff, 24 generals and about 2,000 officers, were taken prisoner. The psychological state of the German command at the moment of capitulation was close to complete collapse. Months of combat stress, hunger, cold, and the realization of inevitable defeat, all this led to deep demoralization. According to eyewitnesses, many officers were in a state of prostration. Some cried, others sat with a detached look, mechanically carrying out orders. Paulus himself, according to the recollections of Soviet officers, looked like a man completely broken morally. He barely reacted to what was happening around him and answered in monosyllables. Only later, already in captivity, did the field marshal begin to recover and realize the scale of what had happened. The capture of the field marshal had enormous significance for the further course of the operation. Firstly, it demoralized the remnants of the northern grouping under the command of General Strecker, which continued to resist for a few more days. Secondly, the capitulation of the army commander psychologically facilitated the surrender of thousands of ordinary soldiers and officers. But perhaps the most important was the propaganda effect. The capture of a field marshal of the German army, an unprecedented case in history, became a powerful blow to the prestige of the Third Reich. This event was widely covered in the Soviet and world press, demonstrating to the whole world that the myth of the invincibility of the Wehrmacht had been finally dispelled. Photographs of the captured Paulus appeared in all the world's newspapers. Hitler was furious when he learned of the capitulation. At his headquarters, he severely reprimanded his generals, accusing Paulus of treason and cowardice. The field marshal was declared persona non grata in Germany, and his family was subjected to repression. But the wheel of history could no longer be turned back. The Battle of Stalingrad was irrevocably lost by the Wehrmacht. After the capitulation of Paulus's southern grouping on February 1st, 1943, in Stalingrad, the last pocket of resistance remained, the northern group under the command of Lieutenant General Karl Strecker. This group, numbering about 40,000 men, occupied the area of the tractor factory and adjacent blocks. Despite the news of Paulus's surrender, Strecker decided to continue resistance, fulfilling the Führer's last order: fight to the last bullet. The Soviet command, seeking to avoid unnecessary losses, attempted to persuade Strecker to capitulate. Parliamentarians were sent to German positions with an ultimatum, but the response was a refusal and increased defenses. General Rokossovsky ordered the offensive to resume. The northern grouping distinguished itself with particular tenacity and defense for several reasons. Firstly, it contained the most ideologically motivated units, including SS divisions. Secondly, the terrain, an industrial zone with massive reinforced concrete structures, provided ideal conditions for defense. Thirdly, many officers and soldiers feared captivity after the numerous war crimes committed on Soviet territory. The assault began on February 2nd with a massive artillery strike. More than 2,000 guns and mortars unleashed a barrage of fire on enemy positions. Heavy howitzers and Katyusha rocket launchers proved particularly effective, destroying even reinforced concrete shelters. After the artillery preparation, assault groups, reinforced by sappers and flamethrower operators, went on the offensive. The battles became exceptionally fierce. The Germans turned every workshop, every administrative building into a fortified strongpoint. To suppress such pockets of resistance, the Soviet command employed a scorched earth tactic, massive use of flamethrowers and incendiary ammunition. Fiery tornadoes burned out entire blocks, rendering enemy positions unfit for defense. One of Strecker's tactical errors was the dispersal of forces over a vast territory, instead of concentrating them on key directions. This allowed Soviet troops to methodically gnaw away, piece by piece, at the German defenses. By the end of February 2nd, the outer lines had been captured, and a decisive assault on the central part of the fortified area was planned for February 3. The Soviet command made its own mistake by underestimating the enemy's ammunition reserves. The Germans, conserving forces, had created significant arsenals in underground bunkers, which allowed them to maintain intense fire even under a complete blockade. This led to unjustifiably high casualties among the attacking units on the first day of the assault. The turning point was the capture of the tractor factory's water tower, a key height that controlled a significant area. Lieutenant Petrov's assault group, in a night battle, managed to penetrate the upper floors of the tower and establish a foothold there, adjusting artillery fire on enemy positions. This allowed several crucial strongpoints of resistance to be literally burned out. By the morning of February 2nd, the situation of Strecker's group had become hopeless. Ammunition was running out, food was practically gone, and the wounded were dying without medical assistance. Cases of insubordination and unauthorized surrender by entire units began among the troops. Strecker, realizing the futility of further resistance, decided to capitulate. Operation Ring became not only a military victory, but also a true laboratory of combat experience, where the latest tactical methods were developed, and the effectiveness of various types of weaponry was tested. A military technical analysis of this operation allows us to identify several key factors in the success of Soviet troops. First and foremost, the scale of the forces and resources involved is impressive. In the final stage of the Battle of Stalingrad, Soviet command concentrated over 7,000 artillery pieces and mortars, which provided an unprecedented density of fire, up to 180 barrels per kilometer of front. Ammunition expenditure also reached record levels. Over 1 million shells and mines of various calibers were fired in the first 5 days of the operation alone. The effectiveness of artillery in urban conditions proved uneven. Direct fire guns showed the greatest effectiveness, especially 45mm anti-tank guns and 76mm regimental guns. They allowed for accurate fire on embrasures and enemy firing points. Howitzer artillery was used to destroy strong buildings and suppress targets deep in the defense. Katyusha rocket launchers created a powerful psychological effect, demoralizing the enemy, although their accuracy in urban conditions left much to be desired. Tank units were used with varying degrees of effectiveness. In the open terrain of the western sector of the Cauldron, tanks operated successfully, breaking through defenses and developing the offensive. However, in urban areas, heavy vehicles became vulnerable to anti-tank artillery and Panzerfausts. Medium T-34 tanks showed the greatest effectiveness, due to their maneuverability and sufficient firepower. Light T-70 tanks were used primarily to support infantry and combat firing points. Aviation played a dual role. Il-2 attack aircraft successfully hit enemy fortifications and concentrations of equipment. Fighters reliably blocked attempts to supply the encircled group by air. However, bombers were used sparingly in urban conditions due to the danger of hitting their own troops. The losses of the sides in Operation Ring were unequal. Soviet troops lost about 26,000 killed and wounded, which accounted for approximately 10% of the total forces involved. German losses were catastrophic. Over 91,000 prisoners, including 24 generals led by Field Marshal Paulus. The exact number of German soldiers and officers killed cannot be established, but according to various estimates, it exceeds 40,000 people. Of particular interest is the analysis of the tactics of assaulting fortified urban areas developed during the operation. The key element was mixed composition assault groups, including riflemen, machine gunners, sappers, and flamethrowers. These small but well-organized units possessed high autonomy and could solve local tactical problems without constant leadership from above. The infiltration method, the penetration of small groups into the gaps between enemy strongholds, allowed for disrupting the integrity of the defense and attacking fortifications from the rear and flanks. The tactic of fragmenting large pockets of resistance into small isolated groups with their subsequent destruction proved highly effective. The experience of the Battle of Stalingrad had a huge impact on the development of military science. The lessons of Operation Ring were carefully studied and systematized in special manuals and textbooks. Many tactical methods developed in Stalingrad were successfully applied by Soviet troops during the liberation of other cities: Kharkov, Kiev, Minsk, Budapest, Berlin. Military theorists from different countries still study the experience of the Battle of Stalingrad as a classic example of the successful encirclement and destruction of a large enemy group in urban conditions. The Battle of Stalingrad and its concluding chord, Operation Ring, forever changed the course of World War II. This battle became not just a military victory, but a profound psychological turning point in the consciousness of millions of people on both sides of the front. For the first time since the beginning of the war, the myth of the Wehrmacht's invincibility was irrevocably shattered. If before Stalingrad the question was about the survival of the Soviet Union, after it was about the inevitable defeat of Nazi Germany. The significance of this victory can hardly be overestimated. On a military strategic level, the largest enemy grouping was destroyed. More than 20 divisions ceased to exist. The Wehrmacht lost about 250,000 men killed, wounded, and captured, losses that Germany could no longer replenish. The initiative on the Eastern Front finally passed to the Red Army. The political consequences were no less significant. Turkey abandoned plans to enter the war on the side of the Axis powers. Japan finally discarded the idea of attacking the USSR from the east. The allies of the anti-Hitler coalition continued Lend-Lease supplies with new energy and intensified planning for a landing in Europe. The Battle of Stalingrad became a true laboratory of military art. The experience of urban combat gained in this battle had a huge impact on the further development of tactics. Mixed composition assault groups, the tactic of infiltration, the method of breaking up enemy defenses. All these techniques, refined in Stalingrad, were successfully applied in the liberation of other cities. Of particular importance was the experience of artillery support for urban combat, including the massive use of direct fire guns and the creation of artillery destruction groups. The lessons of Stalingrad remain relevant for modern military science. The principles of conducting combat operations in urban conditions, developed during Operation Ring, formed the basis of post-war manuals for many armies around the world. Tactical techniques born in the crucible of the Battle of Stalingrad found application in many subsequent conflicts, from Korea and Vietnam to modern local wars. Stalingrad became a symbol of the unbreakable courage and resilience of the Soviet people. The names of the city's defenders, Pavlov, Zaitsev, Chuikov, Rodimtsev, are forever etched in history. But no less respect is deserved by those who, in January-February of '43, put the victorious final touch on this epic battle. The soldiers and commanders of the Don Front under the leadership of General Rokossovsky. Their skill, courage, and selflessness ensured the brilliant conclusion of one of the greatest battles in human history.